Ukraine will not recognize Donbas as Russian, neither de jure nor de facto. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said this after talks in Berlin, stressing that Russia wants to take the region, Ukraine refuses to give it up, and the United States is looking for a possible compromise. One of the ideas discussed is a so-called free economic zone, but Zelenskyy made clear that this does not mean Russian control. He said there is still no consensus on Donbas, and Ukraine's position remains firm, no legal or factual recognition of occupation. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he now sees real readiness for the United States to agree on legally binding security guarantees for Ukraine, guarantees that would work in practice in a similar way to NATO's Article 5. Speaking after talks with partners, Zelenskyy stressed that this would not be political promises, but formal obligations approved by the US Congress.
We have serious movement forward because we are talking about security guarantees that must be voted on by the US Congress. I see that President Trump's team is ready for this. We clearly see that the majority of Congress has a positive attitude toward this, and it is important that this is a legally binding responsibility of our partners in case peace agreements or a ceasefire are violated by the Russian Federation. That means there will be a response similar to NATO's Article 5.
The ceasefire in Ukraine by Christmas looks very unlikely. That is the assessment of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He said Russia is simply not interested in peace talks or a ceasefire right now. According to him, the only thing that could change Moscow's position is stronger pressure and real unity from the West. Tusk stressed that negotiations can only take shape if Russia sees that Europe and its partners cannot be divided. But until then, expectations should be realistic. And here's what he said about using frozen Russian assets for Ukraine, and it sounds far from optimistic. According to the Polish Prime Minister, Europe is still light years away from a decision that would allow frozen Russian money to be used for rebuilding Ukraine, not to mention military support. Right now, the only firm agreement is to keep those assets frozen permanently. Turning them into real money for Ukraine is a completely different step. Tusk made clear that no such decision will be taken at this week's EU summit in Brussels, even though funding for Ukraine for the next 2 years will be discussed. He said there are some indirect options on the table, such as using the frozen assets as a financial leverage or guarantees for loans, but direct use of the money remains a distant goal. Tusk also highlighted a clear gap between Europe and the United States on this issue. According to him, Washington argues that seizing Russian assets outright would make it harder to negotiate with dictator Putin. He added that the US approach is more business-oriented, suggesting that Americans might prefer different mechanisms, possibly even involving consultations with Russia. As a result, Tusk admitted it is hard to speak of a united European-American position on Russian assets. Europe has put its cards on the table. European leaders have presented a joint plan of security guarantees for Ukraine, making it clear that Ukraine's security is inseparable from Europe's own. The plan includes 6 key elements. First, continued military support for Ukraine. Europe believes Ukraine must keep a strong army even in a peacetime, up to 800,000 troops to deter any future attack. Second, European-led multinational forces could be deployed with the US support to help restore Ukraine's military strength, protect its airspace, and support security at sea, including operations on Ukrainian territory. Third, the United States would lead a mechanism to monitor any ceasefire, providing early warning of new attacks and responding to violations. Fourth, the plan speaks about legally binding security guarantees. If Russia attacks Ukraine again, the guarantors would be obliged to respond with a military, intelligence, economic, and diplomatic measures. Fifth, Europe commits to investing in Ukraine's reconstruction, trade, and recovery. Russian assets frozen in the EU would remain immobilized, and Russia would be expected to compensate for the damage it caused. And finally, Europe reaffirms its strong support for Ukraine's path toward EU membership. At the same time, the head of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service says the world has entered a dangerous space between peace and war. In her first public speech as MI6 chief, Blaise Metreweli warned that Russia is deliberately dragging out negotiations on Ukraine and testing the West with actions just below the threshold of open war. According to Metreweli, Moscow is not only waging a grinding war on the battlefield, but also exporting chaos through cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation, and aggressive activity at sea, in the air, and online. She said dictator Putin remains determined to subjugate Ukraine and pressure NATO while shifting the coastal war onto his own population. Metreweli stressed that Britain's support for Ukraine is enduring and that pressure on Russia will continue, because this war is not only about Ukraine's sovereignty, but about European and global security. She also said modern conflict is being reshaped by technology, with intelligence officers now needing to master both human source and code, because the front line is everywhere, from critical infrastructure to people's minds.
We all continue to face the menace of an aggressive, expansionist and revisionist Russia seeking to subjugate Ukraine and harass NATO. I find it harrowing that hundreds of thousands have died, with the toll mounting every day because of Putin's historical distortions and his compromised desire for respect. He is dragging out negotiations and shifting the cost of war onto his own population. But Putin should be in no doubt. Our support is enduring. The pressure we apply on Ukraine's behalf will be sustained, because it is fundamental not just to European sovereignty and security, but to global stability.
Ukraine Security Service says it has disabled a Russian submarine in the Black Sea in a rare and unprecedented underwater drone attack. According to the SBU, the strike took place at the Russian port of Novorossiysk, where Ukrainian underwater drones, known as a subsea baby, hit a Kilo-class submarine. The agency says the attack caused critical damage and put the vessels out of action. The SBU says this is the first time underwater drones have been used to strike a submarine. The submarine was armed with a caliber cruise missiles, which Russia has repeatedly used to strike Ukrainian cities. The operation was carried out jointly with the Ukrainian Navy. According to Ukrainian estimates, the submarine is worth around $400 million. Because of sanctions, the cost of building a replacement could reach up to $500 million. While Donald Trump is pushing for a peace deal on Ukraine, Europe is quietly preparing its societies for a very different scenario, the risk of a new war. According to the Wall Street Journal, security officials across Europe are now openly warning the public that the ceasefire in Ukraine could free up Russian military resources for attacks elsewhere on the continent. Just a decade ago, such language would have sounded extreme. Today, it's becoming a mainstream. European intelligence officials, quoted by Wall Street Journal, say Russia is producing more weapons that it needs for the war in Ukraine, suggesting preparation for future conflicts. At the same time, there is growing concern about Washington's commitment. In the latest US national security strategy, Russia is no longer clearly named as an enemy, a shift that has unsettled many European capitals. Military leaders argue that peace can only be preserved through readiness. Former NATO officials told the Wall Street Journal that Europe must prepare for war in order to deter it. But they also admit this is politically difficult. Polls cited by the paper show that only about a third of Europeans say they would fight to defend their country. Security services warn that Russia is already testing Europe below the threshold of an open war. According to European officials interviewed by Wall Street Journal, cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation campaigns, and pressure on logistics routes are part of a broader Russian strategy to weaken Europe before any direct confrontation. As a result, governments are adjusting course. France is reviving forms of a military service. Germany is running large-scale war simulations, and Britain is refocusing its military planning on Russia. NATO countries have agreed to increase defense spending, though military commanders quoted by the Wall Street Journal say it may still fall short. The message from European security circle is clear and increasingly blunt. The war in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. As Wall Street Journal notes. It is reshaping how Europe thinks about its own survival. That's all for now. For more content, please subscribe.